Hello there, faithful listener. You've tuned in to Season 7 of the Bible Explained podcast. So make sure to grab your cup of coffee, because today we are going to be discussing the book of 1 Samuel. Hey, faithful listeners, welcome and good morning. I hope all of you are ready to read about 1 Samuel 30, because today's portion of scripture is very sad and also very encouraging at the exact same time. So I think that this episode today will be very beneficial for anybody who is going through a bad trial right now. So let's read 1 Samuel 30 verses 1 through 15. And as usual, I'll be reading out of the WEB version. Make sure to grab your cup of coffee or tea this morning. And let's go ahead and give reverence to God's word together. When David and his men had come to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid on the south and on Ziklag, and had struck Ziklag and burned it with fire, and had taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They didn't kill any, but carried them off and went their way. When David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives, their sons, and their daughters were taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voice and wept until they had no more power to weep. David's two wives were taken captive, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the souls of all the people were grieved, every man for his sons and for his daughters. But David strengthened himself in Yahweh his God. David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Please bring the ephod here to me." Abiathar brought the ephod to David. David inquired of Yahweh, saying, "If I pursue after this troop, will I overtake them?" He answered him, "Pursue, for you will surely overtake them, and will without fail recover all." So David went, he and the 600 men who were with him, and came to the brook Besor, where those who were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 stayed behind, who were so faint that they couldn't go over the brook Besor. They found an Egyptian in the field, and brought him to David, and gave him bread, and he ate. And they gave him water to drink. They gave him a piece of cake of figs, and 2 clusters of raisins. When he had eaten, his spirit came to him, for he had eaten no bread, and drank no water for 3 days and 3 nights. David asked him, "To whom do you belong? Where are you from?" He said, "I am a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite, and my master left me, because 3 days ago I got sick. We made a raid on the south of the Kerethites, and on that which belongs to Judah, and on the south of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire." David said to him, "Will you bring me down to this troop?" He said, "Swear to me by God that you will not kill me and deliver me up into the hands of my master, and I will bring you down to this troop." So if you guys remember what's been happening in the last couple chapters, there was a lot going on. Firstly, we know that Saul is about to die, King Saul. We also found out that David has been living this really bad lifestyle where he's not communicating much with God that we know of, and he's actually going out and killing these tribes of people who are enemies of Israel, but he was doing all of that in his own power. He was not talking to God about any of this, and he was also lying about it. So he was lying to the Philistine king, King Achish, about what he was doing. He was telling King Achish, well, I'm going out and I'm attacking all of the Israelites. But in actuality, David was going out and attacking all of the enemies of the Israelites. So now David has been living in the Philistine region for about a year and a half. And what we talked about the other day was that David was starting to potentially think of himself as a Philistine. And he was ready and willing to go to battle with King Achish against the Israelites. But God totally blocked David from being able to do that, because the Philistines did not trust David at all. They were like, "No, we don't want this Israelite man coming to battle with us, because what if he turns on us in the middle of battle?" So King Achish sends David and all of his men home to Ziklag. Ziklag was the city that King Achish had given David to live in. So this is where we leave off today. Here's what verse 1 says. When David and his men had come to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid on the south and on Ziklag and had struck Ziklag and burned it with fire. Now, something really interesting about this is, first and foremost, David and his men traveled 3 days to get to Ziklag, meaning that they had left Ziklag pretty much completely defenseless during that time. So not only was David trying to go to battle with the Philistines completely fruitless, but it also caused destruction for himself. So that's the first thing to notice here. Secondly, notice that the Amalekites are in existence. If you guys remember, King Saul was given the command by God to completely wipe out the Amalekites because they were terrorists. They would kill people, they would torture people, they would burn cities with fire, they would do terrible things to children. They were bad people. And so God had told King Saul years before this takes place to completely kill the Amalekites, and King Saul did not obey and did not listen because the Amalekites, as we see here, were alive and well. And it says that they made a raid on Ziklag and on the south in general. So once again, the Amalekites are back to their old ways of just terrorizing the cities surrounding them. So it says that they burned Ziklag with fire and took captive all of the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They didn't kill any, but they carried them off and went their way. Now, notably, they didn't kill any of the people that were in Ziklag. Instead, they just carried them all off as probably slaves and sex slaves. And honestly, I think that that is a terrible, terrible fate if you are a woman or a child. I'm sure that the women and the children who were carried off were absolutely terrified about it. But was it more kind what the Amalekites did to Ziklag than what David had done to the tribes that he was going and raiding and burning and killing? I don't know. I think that they're both pretty terrible sounding, honestly. But the really cool thing about this is that God is always so merciful. He's so merciful because not all was lost. Even though the Amalekites had come in, completely burned Ziklag to the ground, David still had a chance to recover his family and the families of all of his men. So here's what happens. When David and his men came to the city and saw that it was burned with fire and that their wives and their sons and their daughters were taken captive, David and all the people who were with him lifted up their voice and wept until they had no more power to weep, which makes a lot of sense. You know, like if something like that happened to you, can you imagine if you came home and your entire city, your entire neighborhood was fully burned down to the ground and all of your family members were gone somewhere? Can you imagine how distressing that would be? That would be horrifying. And so these men are crying their eyes out because their entire families are gone. Their children are gone. Their wives are gone. And they're probably beating themselves up for traveling and leaving the city completely defenseless. And even David's wives were taken captive, it says, Ahinoam and Abigail. So David was greatly distressed, but he was distressed for more than just the fact that his wives were taken and Ziklag was burned to the ground. He was also distressed, it says in verse 6, because his people spoke of stoning him, because the souls of all the people were grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. So now David has multiple problems going on. Not only are his wives completely taken from him, and possibly children as well, because we do know that David had some children with both Abigail and Ahinoam. So not only were David's family completely taken from him, but also now the men are so angry at David for what has happened that they are considering killing him. They were probably mad at David because David ordered all of the men to go and fight the battle with the Philistines, but then it didn't even end up happening, and so it was a complete and total waste. They were probably mad at David about that. They might have been mad at David because of the raids that David and the men were doing. Maybe they thought, well, if we wouldn't have gone out and raided those other tribes, then word wouldn't have spread, and maybe the Amalekites wouldn't have come and attacked Ziklag. Now, that being said, though, it is very possible that the Amalekites did not know that the tribes around them were being raided by David, because all of it was really hush-hush. If you look at it, like, David was purposefully trying to keep it a secret. So it is possible that the Amalekites were just doing what they always did and just terrorizing for the sake of terrorizing. But it's possible that David's men were just blaming David for what happened and using every excuse that they could to blame David. But when all of this happens, when David is being threatened by his own men, and when David's family is taken from him and his home is taken from him as well, and not to mention, don't forget that David was also going through the trial of the Philistines completely rejecting him, David is at a very, very low point in his life. And it says that he strengthened himself in Yahweh, his God. So now finally, David is trusting in Yahweh once again, when we don't see any evidence of that happening in the previous chapters. So David strengthens himself in Yahweh when all of these terrible trials are just coming at him left and right. David takes strength in God. So how do we do that? How do we take strength in God when all of these terrible trials just keep coming our way? Well, first and foremost, we search for God. We search for God by reading the Bible and by praying. We can also remember the past things that God has done for us. I've mentioned this before, but I actually keep a list that I update every couple of years of all of the things that I thought were miracles that happened to me in the past, that I saw God just really working in my life. I'll write those things down, and I'll actually take that list out from time to time when I'm really struggling, and I'll read that list and just remember all the good things that God did for me throughout the years. So that's another way we can strengthen ourselves in Yahweh, is by remembering what he has done for us in the past and just having a thankful attitude for what he has done for us. And the third way we can strengthen ourselves in God is by finding encouragement from a mentor or somebody that you know who can really encourage you. And all three of these things should be a go-to when we are struggling in our lives with whatever trials are coming our way. We should be praying, reading the Bible, maybe even fasting if something is really weighing down on you. Secondly, we should be remembering all the things that God has done for us in the past and have a thankful heart for what God has done for us. And thirdly, we should be reaching out to somebody who can give us encouragement. And sometimes when we don't have somebody who can give us encouragement, God will give us encouragement instead. And this has also happened to me many times. You guys know right now, I'm going through a very serious trial on my own with my stomach. Every single thing that I eat is making me very sick. I am unable to keep it down from time to time. And I can't drink coffee anymore. I can't eat any of the foods that I've been eating. My diet is very limited right now. And truly, this has crushed my spirit. I love to eat, and I can't eat or enjoy any of the foods that I used to enjoy anymore. And I've been very upset, and I've been crying about it. But when I cry and I turn to the Bible, it seems like I'm always filled with some sort of encouragement that I read in the Bible. And sometimes God uses these trials to get through to us, to get us back on the right track once again. Because I know for me that when things are going really well, I have a tendency to completely forget about God. But when things aren't going so well, my strength is just gone. And that is when I turn back to God. And this is exactly what David did. When David's spirit was completely crushed, he turned back to Yahweh, his God. And he did this also by asking Abiathar, the priest, to bring the ephod to him. The ephod was the priest's garment that held the Urim and the Thummim. And that was what the Israelites used to use to communicate with God. And so David asks God, it says he inquired of Yahweh saying, if I pursue after these troops, will I overtake them? And God answered David. God answered David. The second David turns back to God, God is answering him. Pursue, for you will surely overtake them and will recover without fail all. So David went. Not only did he strengthen himself in Yahweh and inquired of Yahweh, which is not wrong for us to do. We should be inquiring of Yahweh all the time. We should always be asking for God to give us wisdom. Because what does it say about God? He is the great counselor. He counsels us. He gives us wisdom and knowledge about what we're supposed to do. Not only did David strengthen himself and ask for wisdom from God, but then he obeyed. The second he hears from God, David is out with his men to go find the women and the children that were taken from Ziklag. So David comes to the brook Besor with his 600 men. And what ends up happening is immediately 200 of them are too weak to continue on. Because don't forget that these men have been traveling for at least 3 days, probably closer to 6 actually, because they traveled 3 days to get down to where King Achish was so that they could try to join that battle, but then they were rejected. And so they immediately had to travel 3 days back to Ziklag. And so now they're traveling probably with very low provisions because they couldn't replenish their provisions when they got back to Ziklag, obviously, because everything was burned down. So they had very little provisions to sustain them on. And so immediately, when they get to this brook called Besor, 200 of David's 600 men were so weak that they couldn't continue on. But David does not let this discourage him. Can you imagine? Like, most people would be so discouraged if all of these things were happening to them at the exact same time. They'd be so discouraged, understandably. But David continues obeying, even though 200 men had to stay behind at the brook Besor. David keeps on going with the 400 men that he had. So now it says in verse 11 that they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David and gave him bread and he ate. So they're passing by this field and they see this Egyptian man completely collapsed in the field. And so David takes kindness on this man and feeds him with the provisions that they have. They fed him some bread and some water. And it says that when they fed this Egyptian man, that his strength recovered. Oh, and they also gave him a piece of fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins. So this was the only thing that this man had eaten in 3 whole days, is what it says. His spirit came back to him because he had drank no water for 3 days and 3 nights. So now David asks this man, where are you from and what are you doing? Like, why were you collapsed out in this field? So the man answers, I am a man of Egypt, a servant to an Amalekite, and my master left me because 3 days ago I got sick. So that just shows a little bit more about how the Amalekites treated people, because this young man, this young Egyptian man, was a slave to an Amalekite. And when he got sick on the way home, the Amalekite just abandoned this man out in the field and was like, well, whatever, you're just as good as dead, so I'll just leave you for dead. And I'm sure that this Egyptian man had absolutely no hope of living ever again. But God brought this Egyptian to David. Specifically, not only did God save this young Egyptian man's life, but he also gave David exactly what David needed through this Egyptian man. Because the Egyptian says, I was with my Amalekite master, and we were making a raid on the south, and we attacked all these different towns, and we also burned this city called Ziklag with fire. And the Egyptian, it seems like, has no clue why David was there, right? But yet this was exactly the information that David needed. And so it's a really good thing that David took kindness on this Egyptian man. So David said, "You were part of that raid?" And the Egyptian's like, "Yeah." So David's like, "Will you bring me down to the Amalekite troops? Do you know where they're going?" So the Egyptian says, "You know what? I'll bring you down to the Amalekite troops if you keep me from going back to my master. Please do not send me back to that terrible man, and I will take you where you need to go." So we will finish up this story on Friday. I really love this story so far. It's just very, very encouraging for many reasons. The first reason being that David is kind of a picture of a man after God's own heart, and yet he fails so many times. But yet God is so merciful and forgiving to David every single time David admits fault and comes back to Yahweh. That's the first reason it is so encouraging. And the second reason it's encouraging is that even though trials come our way, God gives us strength to get through them, which is exactly what David wrote about in Psalm 34, verses 4 through 6, which says, "I prayed to the Lord and he answered me. He freed me from all my fears. Those who look to him for help will be radiant with joy. No shadow of shame will darken their faces. In my desperation, I prayed, and the Lord listened, and he saved me from all my troubles." So I find 1 Samuel 30 extremely encouraging because once again, it just shows God's amazing power and might and mercy. So faithful listeners, I hope you're also encouraged by today's episode as well. And I hope that you check out all of the links listed in the description of this episode. I have a new YouTube video coming out very soon. And don't forget that I'm going to be putting up some exclusive content on Ko-fi. When you become a member on Ko-fi, you will be able to see the exclusive content that will be coming out very, very soon. So check out all of those links listed in the description of this episode if you want more content from P40 Ministries or from the Bible Explained podcast. Faithful listeners, I will see you all tomorrow for another episode from the book of Acts. Happy listening, and God bless.